I really and truly appreciate the scan that David just did. I feel as the shadow side of everything he said, all of the struggle that goes into the things that he described that seem to work out, you know. And so, David, thank you for seeing the best side of all of that. All right. We all know that education is really, you know, it's one of the least efficient things in the world, isn't it? That efficiency is not the model. You know, you try hundreds of things, and maybe something works, maybe that time, maybe not another time. And in this, it's very much like writing poetry. And so, David, thanks for putting up with all my revisions. That's the real thing, right? And by the way, hasn't David Grant done wonders and wonderful things with his education and his career and life? And so, congratulations, David, on that. And I'm so honored to be with you and so grateful to be invited to speak on Otwell McLeish. Although I don't know the friends of the foundation of the collection, and I've just met them today, I feel as though I've known them in other ways, deep down inside, via the poetry and the knowledge that there is a McLeish collection and a library that's been preserved here at Greenfield. And I think that David should cite William Stafford as he did. Actually, intuitively spoke to one of my thoughts on the drive out here from Boston. I said, oh, all right, this is now a little bit of insight into the revising mind. I said, damn, I wish I had checked in the William Stafford archives to find out whether or not William Stafford and Otwell McLeish ever had talked or been in conversation. They certainly have been published in Poetry Magazine and other really important places. And Stafford read many, many places around the country in the 60s, and so they had this sneaky little suspicion that there must be some connection. So David, a little bit louder. So David, I've given myself some homework. I'll find out. And we can pass that, if there is any connection, I'll pass that on. I also want to say one other kind of observation, I guess is the right word, about the collection. It is admirable and enviable. It is the kind of thing, I think, that young poets of any age can really benefit from. It is true that most of us, no matter what age we are, when we begin to write poetry, we don't believe that it's real or true or valuable. It's a wonder that anything ever gets written, to be honest, when you think of some of the enormous reinforcements of self-doubt, well, you know what I mean, the way you talk yourself out of a vocation. And it is really important to have these sort of living testaments, these living, I say monuments, but monuments is too strong. You know, it's a little bit too sort of stone-y. But it is a living testament to the life of a writer. And that, I think, has deeply educational implications for anyone who ever wonders what it means to write poetry, to love poetry, to think that literary art counts in the life of a culture. So congratulations also on that. There's a handout in the seats. I hope everyone has one. Do you have one?
Yeah.
Good. It's a poem that McLeish, I don't know exactly when he wrote it, but he clearly wrote it sometime during the era that he was at Harvard teaching the courses that Poetry and Experience, the book, is based upon. So I see it as a perfect introduction to what I'd like to talk about with you today. This poem is called Reasons for Music, and it's inscribed to Wallace Stevens, which you may, again, wonder what their connection was. But you can see from the poem that they are in at least a tacit, if you will, dialogue. Reasons for Music. Why do we labor at the poem age after age? Even an age like this one, when the living rock no longer lives and the cut stone perishes. Holderlin's question. Why be poet now when the meanings do not mean? When the stone shape is shaped stone. Dürftiger Zeit, time without inwardness. Why lie upon our beds at night, holding a mouthful of words, exhausted by the absence of the adversary? Why be poet? Why be man? Oh, it's out in the uttermost Andes, mortised, enormous stones are piled. What is man? Who founds a poem in the rubble of wild wilderness? The acropolis of eternity that crumbles time and again is mine, my task. The heart's necessity compels me. Man, I am, poet, must be. The labor of order has no rest to impose on the confused, fortuitous flowing away of the world. Form, still, cool, clean, obdurate, lasting forever, or at least lasting, a precarious monument promising immortality. For the wing moves, and in the moving balances. Why do we labor at the poem out of the turbulence of the sea? Flower by brittle flower rises the coral reef that calms the water. Generations of the dying fix the sea's dissolving salts in stone. Still trees their branches, immovable, meaning the movement of the sea. I looked at the poem and I thought, this is a pretty formal enterprise, as MacLeish was, indeed, a formal poet. A formal poet maybe in free verse a lot, but he was indeed a formal poet. And you can see that this is a pretty oracular, formal announcement about what poetry is or should be. And I don't know about you, but I sure do hear in it a conversation with his younger self, who wrote Ars Poetica, which everybody knows, or at least will know at some point or another. It's in every anthology for those of you who are in early courses. And everyone who's ever read MacLeish knows that Ars Poetica is the one poem everyone knows him by. It's also a poem that I think he was in dialogue with his entire life. He may, in fact, I think, been arguing with himself his entire life about that damned line. Poem must not mean, but be. Right? And I've been thinking about this ever since David invited me. When he invited me, I sort of seized upon the opportunity for another reason I'll tell you, but deep down inside I'm really curious as to how that line worked out over the course of his life. And I do believe that over the course of his life, he actually both regretted and loved the fact that he created an aphorism. And he argued with his own aphorism. And what I'm going to speak about today in some way is his argument with himself, which you may know is Yeats's definition of what a real poem is. Anyway, it always comes out of the argument with oneself. In this Reasons for Music, you can hear him puzzling the question of meaning. So let me tell you, I'm going to give you 3 things to keep in mind as I go into the formal dimension of my own talk, okay? And so imagine there's a blackboard behind me and I've written these 3 things in very large letters, but they're easy to remember. You ready? The when. If you turn the page, you can see I mean the when food, the G, okay? So we'll call this, part 1 is the when, or the sense of the when, all right? Part 2 in my talk. You ready? A means to meaning. A means to meaning. And then part 3, you've heard it already when I congratulated David about, you can certainly hear it in Reasons for Music. It is, I think, Archibald MacLeish's and mine and yours sense of the worthiness, the human value of a project of poetry. That it is worthy and valuable and humanly worth doing. And it plays a part in our lives. So it's the when, a means to meaning, and worthiness. Okay? I do have a little bit of a formal presentation, so you'll forgive me if I read a little bit of it and then step away from it as the Spirit moves me. What I'll do is I'll go through those three dimensions of poetry and experience. Then I think we'll talk. If you'd like to ask some questions, make some observations, that'd be great. And then I'm going to read some poems of mine from my most recent book that have some resonance with what I hope, with what I've said and what McLeish wrote in that book. In the summer of 1975, my then girlfriend, now and still wife, we got a job as an au pair couple for a very wealthy elderly couple who owned a farm on Clark Hill in southern New Hampshire. Some of you may know it. It's just above it's just south of New Boston. My wife was to assist in the housework, and I was to assist in the fields. There was a permanent hired man who lived there all year with his family. When the summer ended, oh, by the way, it was also at Hereford. For a tax write-off, they had a herd of Herefords. It's a good way to do it, you know, if you afford it. And when the summer ended, I decided to take a year off from graduate school. I had passed all of my qualifying stuff, and I wasn't sure that I really wanted to do a PhD and be a teacher and all of that. So, and I was worried about my poetry. And so I took a year off from graduate school to decide whether or not I'd continue. I proposed to my boss that I could perhaps stay on in the back apartment of the hired man's house for the winter. In exchange for the roof over my head, I'd help feed the cattle, etc. So we agreed. The leaves turned, the snows fell, and I, for what I think was only the second time in my life, as I count them up, was alone. My wife went back to Boston. She was going to graduate school at Harvard. I was there in the back of the farmhouse. And I had a bedroom upstairs and a small kitchen area below. And I had, you know, some minimal chores, but as the snow set in, even they became kind of infrequent. And I had writing time. It was a self-granted, what should we call it, writer's retreat, or even a residency. I thought, I should devote myself to writing things that will make money. You know, and then I can write my poetry. And so for the first 3 or 4 months, I tried to write story. I'm sorry for you in the back. I was confiding to people up here. A sin, right? The first 3 or 4 months, I tried to write stories. I said, I should be able to make money with stories. I can write. And of course, I went into the worst kind of skid. I couldn't write a thing. I mean, everything I started turned bad. And I remember that from that first 3 months, there was David, the hired man, had killed a deer and had hung it up for curing. And I thought, oh, that's a great story. And I was trying to write story after story about David killing the deer and hanging it up. And nothing ever worked. By the way, that only turned out to be a poem a few years after that. And even that poem I couldn't find. I'm sorry. I looked for it for you, just to sort of, you know, give you a sense of the futility of that particular enterprise. But as the winter really settled in, I decided that I needed to learn more about poetry. Actually, at the end of the year, I did decide that I would go to graduate school. I don't blame McLeish for that. I blame myself utterly. But I think it was a really good decision, as it turned out. But I also had the strong sense that I really needed to spend time learning the art. I don't know what that meant to me at that time. I knew it didn't mean going to classes. I had done all of that. I was well-read for my age. And it didn't mean actually even being in a writing group. I needed to do something very, very solitary with this. Truth is, I was as uncertain as to who or what I was as I ever had been. But by the end of that dry spell, poetry was starting to become my ally. And though the path would be as rocky as any, at least I could start to see that. During that winter, I read, among other things, this copy of Archibald McLeish's Poetry and Experience. When David asked me to give this lecture, I truly did not hesitate. He will bear witness. And I quickly had in mind what I wanted to do. I wanted to reread the book that I know had meant a great deal to me at what I consider to be now a very young age. one that had perhaps shaped my life and my work in ways that I didn't know yet, even as I stood here or stand here. Certainly had helped me. And I wanted to rediscover what I thought of as this good book that I had kept with some of its original ink. Kept on my shelf with me all these years. I wanted to weigh it in the light of the writing and reading I've done since, and I wanted to wonder out loud with you how it might guide me and others to discern what was relevant about it in the present tense. And in the process, I think that maybe show you some poems that I think have echoes of that book in them. I should say right away, I'm not a McLeish scholar. I don't even sort of worry about the anxiety of influence, a concept that for me doesn't have much merit directly, although I know unconsciously I'm sure it's there. But I don't think of I think of myself as really, privileged to have, this indirect friendship with Archibald MacLeish, a founder of modernism in America, certainly. I had many encounters with him in my studies because I wrote a doctoral dissertation on Frost and Williams and Stevens. And so that brought me into the whole question of American modernism. And then, of course, turned out to be more problematic as the century wore on into World War II. And then, as we all know, like for instance, with Ezra Pound being in St. Elizabeth's Hospital as a compromise formation for his propaganda for Mussolini during World War II. And Archibald MacLeish being a lawyer, helping getting him out. That story always stuck with me. I don't know why. I don't even know now, after reading the interviews, the wonderful interviews in Reflections, exactly why that story is so important. And MacLeish sort of later seems to have kept, didn't want to give himself heroic dimensions in that regard. But still, I think, in as much as I discredit Pound for his thinking, as well as some of his poetry, I credit MacLeish for understanding poets in mental hospitals. It doesn't seem right. It wasn't even intended to be funny, but it is, isn't it? When I first opened the book, this is a little bit of nostalgia for those of you who are of a certain age. When I first opened the book, it was this bright, snowy morning, very cold outside, and WGBH's Robert J. Lortzima was on the radio with Morning Pro Musica. I can remember this. And I opened it saying to myself, what could this poet say to me about my writing and my experience? And so, I'll do it again. I'll open the first pages for you. And you can almost join with me. If you turn the page in the handout, you will all bear witness. Page 2, Poetry and Experience, is the first section of Liu Chi's Wen Fu. And so, if you will allow me, I'm going to read it out loud. The Wen Fu is an ars poetica, and it's actually more than that. It's I think 10 parts to it. It's in verse, and it's about writing poetry. But this was what I read the first day. Taking his position at the hub of things, the poet contemplates the mystery of the universe. He feeds his emotions and his mind on the great works of the past. Moving along with the 4 seasons, he sighs at the passing of time. Gazing at the myriad objects, he thinks of the complexity of the world. He sorrows over the falling leaves in virile autumn. He takes joy in the delicate bud of fragrant spring. With awe at heart, he experiences chill. His spirit solemn, he turns his gaze to the clouds. He declaims the superb works of his predecessors. I'll say that again, he declaims them. He declaims the superb works of his predecessors. And then he croons the clean fragrance of past worthies. He roams in the forest of literature and praises the symmetry of great art. Moved, he pushes his books away and takes the writing brush that he may express himself in letters. Well, if I may. So I had a big round table with books and stuff on it, right? and I'm in that kitchen which was my living room. And so I read this, and I don't know if I did. I mean, I'll make it up. You can sort of bear with me on that. I pushed my books away and started to write a poem. If I didn't do it then, I did it another day. You know, it was that tremendous sense, oh, that someone has said something that I know so well. Those of you who have written poetry, I hope will bear witness, that the experience of the muse is not, you know, always, what should I say, you know, a divine visitation, right? that in fact in our time, without a clear sense of the divine or deities, you know, one has to wonder what the hell are muses. You know, one can psychologize it and say, well, isn't the unconscious welling up and so on. But you know, there is something that one has to say about the Wen Fu and Archibald MacLeish and poetry experience, beginning with it. It is a, what should we call it, a demused description of the writing of poetry. And for someone like me who's easily impressed with, you know, I grew up a Catholic, there's all sorts of, you know, hierarchical spiritual dimensions to my life. Someone who's, you know, easily impressed with ideas of spirits visiting you, the idea that this, too, was like, this was writing poetry, that this was a muse, that the work of others could be a muse. And then, of course, that I remembered. I said, well, now when you think about it, how many times have I written poems in the margins of other people's books? Right? How many times have I written poems in the margins of my own notebooks when I'm at a class? Don't forget, I'm still a graduate student, so you have to understand, I'm still thinking like a student. And I'm thinking of all the times that I've written poems that have been in response to other poets. Now, I will strive, but I can't tell you how important that realization was to me when I read this. But I know that it allowed me, it sanctioned, it endorsed, it supported, it encouraged me, you know, the rest of my life, to this very day, to be able to feel really terrific about opening up somebody else's book of poetry, reading a great line and saying, I want to write a poem, or I want to write my own line, or I didn't know you could do that, or wow, that's interesting, I wonder if I could do that, or all of those variations on that kind of inspiration. It's kind of interesting, too, that in terms of high modernism, that MacLeish should begin poetry experience, which, as I learned from this wonderful book, which I totally recommend to everybody, Reflections, edited by Bernard Drebeck, who's in the house in the back, and Helen Ellis is no longer with us, but this is a really terrific book, and David sent me a copy, and they interviewed MacLeish over the course of many, many months, and covering the entire length and breadth of his life, and they do a wonderful set of interviews around his time at Harvard, and these lectures that form the foundation of poetry and experience. I didn't know that when I was reading the book. I just thought it was a book. When I read that in this, I realized that I had done some self-education, really. It was as if reading poetry and experience had been going to his classes. You know, he was still with us, but no longer teaching. I can get to that point in a minute. He was just down the road from me in Boston. But suffice it to say that I had suddenly encountered in this book, and I realize now, MacLeish in the classroom. And he had much to teach me. He says in Poetry and Experience that this first section of the Wen of Lu Qi is, quote, nothing less than how a poem gets written. And I would say to him, if he were here, and I hope he is, that I thank you for that. That is a really fine piece of advice to propose to a young poet, and I will give it a name. He was proposing a processual relationship with this art. He was saying that the art is not done in isolation, although it's nice when you're alone. But you're never really alone. You're entering into a large gathering of poets for over the centuries. Moreover, I love the fact that he insists on saying these things out loud. Now, this is true for me, and I hope at one point for every single one of you, it's really good to be all alone and to recite a poem out loud. Not for anyone else but you and the poet who's maybe listening, you know, another dimension. I also found this opening section of Poetry and Experience reassuring in another way. I confess a more academic way, but still, you know, I don't share the common prejudice against education in relation to art. You know, I think the ivory tower is a sort of stupid idea. And we know that those of us who work hard in it know it's not an ivory tower. But I also know that it does provide you with some sacred space to really think about things. And so I was really struck by the fact that the Wen Fu of Liu Qi and the thought of Archibald MacLeish sort of had at its sort of center a table, books on it. That meant a lot to me. I said, I think I'm going to go to graduate school, go back and finish my thesis. You know, that a stack of books on the table is not a bad thing, as I try to demonstrate to my right. Finally, I wanted to say that I did know something about imagism. I knew something about the vogue for Asian poetry in the early part of the 20th century. I mean, MacLeish learned something from Ezra Pound. I knew that his aphorism, in some way, about poetry not meaning but being, did come out of that contentious time in which to try to articulate the experience of the poem was really the key, and I think that's what his aphorism is all about. I think he is going back to Liu Qi, and in part he's remembering his own beginnings in poetry, and especially the question of imagism, which that's the end of the Wen. And now the means to meaning. Another dimension of this moment in my life in reading his book is his really quite brilliant reading of a variety of implications in the Wen Fu of Liu Qi. He says, quote, practically, to Liu Qi, the beginning of a poem involves, and I'm going to have to interpret MacLeish. This is kind of like a little bit difficult on his part, but I think I know what he's getting at. To Liu Qi, the beginning of a poem involves not a single electric pole thrust deep into the acids of the self, but a pair of poles. A man, we will forgive him his sexism and his gender skews, right? You know, he's writing this in somewhere in the 1950s and 60s. He's writing it with Mad Men. A man in the world opposite. A poem in the Wen Fu, he says, begins not in isolation, but in relationship. There is the writer here, and over there is the mystery of the universe. MacLeish proposes that it is in the space between the self and the world that the image or the poem is created. Now, I don't really know about the larger psychology of artistic creation, but one of the things I think he's getting at is that there is this sense, this romantic sense, that there is an upwelling, from within the self, that the creation of art is really made from within this way. And there's this sort of effort on his part to sort of propose that whatever art is, it's not just the self. It's not, as he likes to say elsewhere in this book, solipsistic. It is the self engaged in the world in some way or another. Now, as I say, this is a little bit, MacLeish, right? He's talking to himself, wondering a little bit about how a poem can mean and be. And so let me see if I can go on. Now, that's what I just said. What does he mean by this? I can remember pondering, never quite sure of exactly what he meant, but truly loving the idea that a poem is created in the space in between the self and the world. It meant that the poem was not solipsistic and not a retreat from experience, but rather consciousness in labor with experience. Oh yeah, as long as I'm in the confessional mode, I want to show you something. You'll have to bear with me. You've been a witness for the group, but just say this is true, please. Look what I wrote at the bottom of that. This is shameful, but it's endearing too. I said, he says, a poem begins in the Wen Fu, not in isolation, in relationship. And I wrote, amazing! I have used the very words. It's embarrassing but delightful. Well, I don't know where and when I did, but maybe I'd been in a graduate seminar with somebody, arguing with somebody about something. In any case, I was trying to argue out of or away from the solipsistic idea that a poem really is just self-enclosed in the poet in some fundamental way, talking to himself. A page or so later, McLeish tries to explain himself again. What Lucci is saying is indeed something quite unexpected. He is saying that the poet's art is a means to meaning, a means by which the world can be made to mean. And as I see it, this is where the rubber meets the road in McLeish's thought in this book. You can hear how he is thinking about his earlier formulation about how a poem should not mean but be, and trying to change it. I have a friend, David Barber, who has written, a scholar and poet, but he's written a fundamental critique of McLeish's development, saying he sort of gave up on modernism and began to emphasize meaning in the middle and later parts of his life, partially because of his deep involvement with the public realm in Washington and then at Harvard. And I don't think David is wrong on that, and there's some truth to that. But at the same time, I want to pause for a minute and think about the Ars Poetica and its high modernist injunction to let the image do the talking, to evoke the feeling so that one experiences the poem as an event rather than anything else. I think that there is some fundamental continuity between the aphorism in Ars Poetica and his idea in Poetry and Experience, that the poem is a means to meaning. Maybe it's trying to square the circle, but I think maybe not. I think that when I look at a poem, must not mean but be, I start to hear a little bit of a binary opposition that he's probably trying to get away from, right? Meaning, being, come on. Did you really have to have it that clear, right? And it comes out of that struggle to invent modernism, right? And I think as a, more mature poet and man, that his idea was to try to think, what did I really mean by that? And I think this is what he meant, that the poem created in the space between the self and the world is not itself meaningful, but is itself provides an experience which allows meaning to be invented. Something along that line. Does that make sense, what I just said? I'm not trying to sort of be scholastic or Thomistic, but I think there's some sense of him, the world, and that poem as an experience that he really wants to preserve. All right? And meaning is what happens when you stand inside the experience, potentially. I don't share, by the way, thank you for the hopeful optimism part, David. I'm not sure I'm still quite so hopeful and optimistic, but that comes with age, That what happens in my life is that I don't feel quite as optimistic as Archibald McLeish does, that that's what happens. Frankly, I don't think he does either. I think when he gets to talk about Rimbaud, for instance, he really does understand what he doesn't do, which is really a kind of nihilism, right? And there's worth in some kind of nihilistic things too, And so, but I think that this is a really decent formulation, not just of the Wen-Fu of Lucci, but of the aesthetic of Archibald McLeish. Let's go back to the poem I read in the beginning. Isn't that a poem that stands somewhere between the self and experience? You enter into it, make a typo or two, read it, and then you start to hear, oh yeah, this is a poem that's actually defending poetry. It's an apology for poetry, in that old-fashioned use of that word. It's an apology for the poet's life, and it is in dialogue with Wallace Stevens, who himself had his own version of an apology or a justification of this art. Which brings me to part 3, the worthiness. I had to make, of course, terribly cruel decisions. David will, I hope, bear witness to this. I do terrible, my wife will definitely bear witness. I do these terrible things. I have to prepare everything before I start taking things out. So I had everything in the book under control. And then about, over the weekend, I said, yeah, that's 3 hours, right? So I had to make my decisions over the weekend. And what I decided was this, that I would tell you about what I think is the fundamental realization that McLeish had in the beginning of the book, and then I would just summarize the rest of it. But I can tell you, there is in this book a polemical impulse, even though he got sick at the end of I think he got sick toward the end of these lectures, and he also he had other lectures he was going to do How many? Yeah, 6 more. And then because he was sick, I forget what the illness was, but he really didn't. He thought, okay, these 4 lectures in the second half of the book will do it. And they do, as a matter of fact, because I think there is a polemical drive. He's trying to drive home an argument in this book. And it's not about imagism. It's not even about ars poetica, if you will. It is, I think, a paradigmatic, and there's a great American tradition of this, by the way, certainly from Emerson and maybe the Puritans on, but there is a desire here in this book to claim that this art is worthy of adult human engagement. Now, why would anyone have to do that? Certainly, you could say to yourself, don't you know that already? But I don't think people do, anyways, in general. And I think that McLeish understood American society and American culture. Part 2 is called The Shape of Meaning. Part 2 tells you what he's really wondering about in this book. He's wondering how poets actually do shape meaning. He examines the work of Emily Dickinson, of Yeats, of Rimbaud, and of Keats. I loved reading these examinations this time. My notes in the book the first time were all about what I just talked about. And now and there I am, I'm just terrible. It's no doubt a very valuable book. Those are my pencils, you can see this. I was just underlining like crazy in these examinations of these 4 poets. And it's because I was old enough to realize what's driving them. These shapes of meaning, these chapters of this book, constitute an act of faith in poetry as a humane art, something important enough to spend a life inside of, and something important enough to bring to others. I don't share, as I said, McLeish's sense of poetry as always a means to meaning. I'm not sure I even share his sense there's a meaning to be had, but I do share his sense of the importance and the dignity of this art. I see it in an Emersonian way, that he is in fact doing a secular homily or sermon when he talks about those 4 poets that are, our inheritance. Those classes at Harvard, and I even wonder what his voice sounds like. Someone was saying he was very oracular. His classes at Harvard must have been terrific. I wish I could have sat in on them. I wish I had gone down from New Boston to visit him. He was alive when I'm having these experiences in the kitchen of the back room at Clark Hill Farm. I know this from Bob Dylan went to see him then, right? You know that story of him visiting him, right? They think they could do a collaboration on one of his plays. And I can't believe I never did think to go see him. But that too is in a way a testimony to what this book is about. It is a book about poetry, not about celebrity, not even about academic importance. It's about this art that you often do by yourself and then bring to others. I'm watching the time, and I'm going to take a minute now and maybe say one sort of swooping remark at the end, and then ask if there'd be any questions. Okay? What he gave to me, my friends, as a young poet, wondering about the place of study in the life of a writer, was that the traditions that I inherited were well worth my time. That I didn't know how I would turn out, but that they were worthy. And that was all right. That was good enough for me to try to put that kind of work at the center of my life. So that's the story of my experience of poetry and experience. Would anyone like to ask a question? And I've got stashed in the back here. I'm going to read some poems. If there's an awkward silence, I'm definitely going to fill it with. And if there isn't an awkward silence, that's great too. Blair, my esteemed friend and colleague from Suffolk.
It seems to me that a good poem is an illumination, and that sort of seems to me the answer. I mean, any really great art, you have this experience of being illuminated, and it's not a lesson. It's not
Yes.
an abstract statement. It's illumination.
And in fact, I remember somewhere in my talk here, I did make a little remark, it's not epiphanies, it's not, that the means to meaning You see, I take his phrase, which is very, I think, very handsome indeed. The means to meaning is like illumination. It's a light that's shown on something that may then be meaningful, right? I mean, there is something kind of supple about his idea. I wish you were here. I'd ask him, he probably would say, "Are you giving me too much credit?" And I don't think so. I think there's something very supple about a means to meaning. And that, the Ars Poetica, for instance, in all of its modern clarity, doesn't have. And it's kind of nicely messy. And then, but it does illuminate. And illumination is, less, it's not syllogistic, is it? Or epiphanic. It's nothing like that. It's just light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking.
Bernard, would you, I mean, I don't know if everyone knows this, but you are the editor of Reflections along with Helen Ellis, so thank you.
I'm not well enough to stand. Anyway, I just wanted to say that your self-discovery that happened in the kitchen on the table and your realization that time alone was really important in your development and your choices that you made after. They parallel what McLeish himself did when he was 31, left the legal profession with a wife and 2 children at the time, and went to Paris for 6 years to become, as he said, to become a poet, to write the lines that he wanted to write. I thought it was so interesting that, in a sense, you equated that and followed that same thing.
And again, because of that really terrific book. By the way, there is a copy of the book in the Suffolk Library, independent of me. Could be my friend Blair, but it is a really invaluable book for McLeish, to understand McLeish. And I was really glad to read in greater detail about his decision at that moment. And I did know about this from others recounting how he went down Park Street Station and ended up in Paris. Right?
Yeah, the walk from Boston, where he was engaged,
Right.
to Cambridge. To
Right, that's what it was. Yeah, that's what
But
it
the
was.
other thing I wanted to say was, he has a brilliant summation at the end of his Washington experience, where he was Librarian of Congress appointed by Roosevelt, where he was Undersecretary of State in the last year. By the way, he despised Stettinius, who was the Secretary of State. But he has a paragraph in which he summarizes that the pressure cooker of Washington and how important that was to his development as an artist, that it indeed gave him the raw material from which he could produce art. So then, and again, it parallels what you've been saying about.
And don't you think too that this? I mean, as David was saying about my work with William Stafford's poetry. Stafford is CEO in World War II, and McLeish, Assistant Secretary, Undersecretary of State. Just think about what they talk about, if they could, right? I think they have a lot to talk about in a weird way, because I think that the question on the table is the poet's relation to experience, right? Now, I'm not sure it's always healthy to get a job in government, right? I mean, I'm not a right winger, so don't misinterpret that. But I think that the question of having that much responsibility, there's a price to be paid for that. I think he paid a price for it. I think he knew it too, which is why he luxuriated in the Harvard appointment. I think that was luxury. That was what he had earned by putting in serious time in the 40s in Washington. He had no doubts that was. We were talking earlier. He had some doubts, as you know from the interview. He had some doubts about what he would teach, but he had no doubts that he belonged there, and he belonged to. He deserved a sinecure job like that. Although he worked hard as a teacher, we have to say that. Yeah.
It seems like, from how I understand you talk, you said that there's something of a binary relationship between a poem meaning and a poem being.
He sets it up that way in Ars Poetica.
So then, I guess my question to you is, on that spectrum of
Yeah.
meaning and being, where do you think your own work falls?
Oh, great question. Very nice.
Thank you.
That's terrific. Early on, I think I was more toward the meaning side. Instinctively, intuitively. My own life story required that I develop what I thought of as an understanding of some terrible mysteries. Ranging from childhood on into the military, in the Vietnam War. And I felt I come from a background where responsibility is, understood. That there was a certain kind of, that poetry, if it were to justify itself, should be responsible to the meaning of the experience. now we walk back a few years, you know, and I feel like my earlier poems are kind of limited by that. I don't forego meaning, but I am taking much more joy in the being. I paused because I was going to say, can I illustrate this with something? I will illustrate it. It's a great question. And I think it's also, I like also the possibility one can be in different places in that spectrum at different times. And what I just said is much too neat, of course. It's not really as true as that. I remember writing some very opaque, you know, poems as a younger person. And I have to find them, I guess. That's why I have to resurrect those days. But well, that's a really, what's your name?
Willie.
Willie, thank you. That's a great question. It's kind of like a natural intro, isn't it? I should really do that. I'm going to read some poems. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
A lot of writers, especially in their beginning stages, face, you know, that question of finding their own voice within their writing.
Yep.
When did you start learning that this is my voice, this is what I can use, this is me in writing, and as being honest as you can about in the writing form?
You, like Willie, that's a spectacularly great question. There's a question in my doctoral dissertation about Frost and Williams and Stevens. And they use the metaphor of voice. I'm not sure I fully endorse the metaphor of voice anymore as an analytic thing, you know, like to talk about somebody else's voice, right? But I have a strong feeling right now that, first of all, I know what you're talking about, the idea of a voice. What if I put it this way? You know, when did I first become aware of the fact that I might be doing something with these poems that are, you know, completely and utterly specific to me? And when I say that, I mean not just the meanings, but the beings, but the art of them, you know? And as I began to think that through, after my first book, I began to start to get a sense of what that voice might be. Again, I should illustrate this, but let me describe it first. My first book was all the poems I had to write as a younger person. It took me many years. I was 45 before my first book came out. And as I said, I was dealing with things that were hard to find words for. But that process began with that winter in New Hampshire. So I was about 15 years or maybe more than that after that, the first book came out. The second book came out, you know, for me relatively quickly thereafter in 2000. And it was after, because of my first book and my experience as a conscientious objector in the military during the Vietnam War, I almost said World War II. Because of my connection to the Women Joiner Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences, I ended up beginning to visit Vietnam. And I visited Vietnam purely as a literary person. My first step off an airplane in Vietnam was not as a soldier, but as a poet. And I met poet after poet, and I was, first of all, I confide this to you, this isn't a secret, but I will confide it. I felt like going to Hanoi in 1995 and meeting Vietnamese poets. I felt like I stepped back, like Woody Allen in the movie, to Paris in the 1920s. It was such a rich literary culture. And poetry was honored, you know, not in the breach, but in every way. It was central to the Vietnamese identity, historically as well as the present tense. And I felt, I didn't know what I was learning, but I was learning something. And I had to figure out that. And so my second book, really, I do think of it as a dialogue between myself and Vietnamese culture and the history, the painful history. On the other side of that, I started to feel like the poems I'm writing were really mine. I don't know why this is so, but I do believe that it's that sort of intersection of self and other that was sort of done in a macro way, that suddenly I said, okay, you know, I think I'm going to grow as a writer, but I'm not going to be surprised by that growth or doubt it, right? And so it was that really, so I feel like it was yesterday that, the answer to your question is, yesterday, I wrote a poem, I think, yeah, that does sound like it. Okay, I'll read some poems.
Okay.
On the back side, just because he does have a really terrific chapter on Emily Dickinson, I sent David some poems, and Some of you have them in class, but I thought everyone, might enjoy a little homage to Emily Dickinson from my most recent book, Nobody To. No, the book is called Looking House, but the poem is Nobody To. I would be small and innocuous, as harmless as the wind that lifts the grass lightly and bends the lupins that new stems barely green. I would pause in affirmation of the squirrels in the pond, and back arching, and torso rippling into a question that flees before the answer. I would teach my heart how to be a heart, help the doors open wide, invite the tall shadows to peek in, curious strangers, chambers brimming over within. I want to praise myself. I'm so glad to read that poem out loud to you. It really does illustrate what I learned from the book. My relationship with Emily Dickinson is, it's distant. I don't have a lot. I love the dashes. I'm deeply connected to her dashes. Truly, I am. And William Stafford was also. And I know that awaiting me in my coming years is a deep pondering of her, her sense of just how difficult it is to be alive, to have a sense of the soul, right? And I know what's waiting for me. This is like a prologue to that, right? And I thought, oh, good, I'm in dialogue with her. And it's that sense of dialogue with another, the world of poetry that McLeish's book is so, so good about. This is a poem that is dedicated to a dear friend of mine, a poet from Ireland named John Dean, John F. Dean, not of Watergate fame. And I included it because, like the Emily Dickinson poem, I included it in the class handout, and like the Emily Dickinson poem, it is in dialogue with another writer. And not, I hope not in a solipsistic way, but in an illuminating way. Shall we try it? Credo. It's from John F. Dean. It references a book of his called Manhandling the Deity. Credo. Unholy in the beginning. And symphony to end. Manhandling the Deity. Your roughed up book path through gate and garden, through fields of gorse and bog cotton, and a world stilled for a second as if it had stopped breathing. An instant in which the heart floats like a planet on nothing. The eyes are open, eager for flensing. Reason is pared down to a pulse and held off for the less than an instant the words need to thread one soul to the next. I believe in such strange, incomplete rhymes, in words alone, and what lives in between them.